Taylor was the owner of what later became Macy's at 11th and Main Street, Taylor Dry Goods Company. And in the days that it was named the Taylor Dry Goods Company, what is now called the Oakwood Country Club was formed in the name of the Progress Club in 1871 on the 3rd floor. They had their card playing and dancing and fancy dining room on the 3rd floor, no elevator, of the Taylor Dry Goods Company building before they moved to Adler's clothing store at 1208 Main Street. And from there in 1893 to 10th and Washington on Quality Hill. We're standing at the grave of Marcus R. Cone, the first rabbi in Kansas City. Came here in 1870 as a mohel to officiate at the bris, the circumcision of a boy in the fall of 1870. He remained here for Rosh Hashanah services and Yom Kippur, and the people who attended the services, the pioneer community of about 25 families, liked his way of preaching so well that they hired him. Now, Marcus Cone, M.R. Cone, was not an ordained rabbi, but he knew sufficient Hebrew and spoke a good English to be acceptable. He also spoke German. He was born in Poland. He spent a good deal of time in England, where he married an English-born wife who's buried next to him. Then went to Australia. From Australia, he went to Victoria, British Columbia. From there, he went to Sacramento. It's amazing how we can find out from old records where people lived at one time or another. In 1870, he established himself as a mohel in Chicago and advertised every week in the Israelite, a paper published by Isaac Mayer Wise of Cincinnati. And he advertised his availability as a mohel, and he came here for that purpose. Cone was hired for 1 year and rehired in 1871, but a year later he resigned voluntarily and established the Chevra Bikur Cholim. Now, what does that mean? It means Society for Visiting the Sick. Unfortunately, it seems that the Chevra Bikur Cholim spent more time burying the dead than visiting the sick. Put it another way, if you were visited by someone from the Chevra Bikur Cholim, it meant that you were not going to be long for this life. Cone went to Chicago and studied medicine, and we have certification that he did in fact become an MD later in life. He died precisely to the day, 20 years after he had preached his first sermon in Kansas City. He died here of malaria, undoubtedly contracted while he and his wife lived in Australia before coming to the Americas. Buried next to him, large sandstone marker for his wife, Julia, English-born, and it was in her memory. She died in the early 1870s. here in Kansas City. It was widely beloved. It was a very large funeral, and it was in her memory that the Chevra B'nai Jehudah was established by her husband. In 1877 or 78, Marcus Cohen conducted worship services for the B'nai Jehudah Chevra, which eventually became what we today know as Beth Shalom Synagogue. So it might be said that Cohen was the first rabbi of two congregations, B'nai Jehudah and Beth Shalom. Rebecca Stern came here with her children from Osceola, Missouri, after the death of her husband, Moses Stern, year 1900, and we have also by her side the two graves of children of hers, Lloyd Stern, who died as a relatively young man and who was active in Jewish scouting in Kansas City, and Miss Claire Stern, who for many, many years was the principal of the B'nai Jehudah Sabbath School, a free school for children of families who had fled Tsarist Russia. The free school was first held at the temple at 11th and Oak Street, later at the Jewish Educational Institute on Admiral Boulevard, and lastly at the Jewish Community Center on Elmwood Boulevard. It was a free school with trained, salaried teachers paid for by B'nai Jehudah. In 1942, the children of that school were so few that it did not warrant a separate institution, and they were merged into the regular religious school of the congregation, whether or not they were children of members. We're at the graves of Benjamin Feineman and of his wife Betty. Benjamin Feineman was the president of B'nai Jehudah at its founding, became president again in later years. He was the patriarch of the congregation. He started out as a wealthy man, partner in a wholesale liquor firm in St. Joseph, transferred the business to Kansas City in 1868, and in 1870 married Betty Binswanger of St. Joseph, age 17. He was 44 at the time. He had previously wooed Betty's mother, Mrs. Elise Binswanger, a widow whose husband had been murdered in Clay County in a little store that he had purchased on coming to this country. The people he bought it from came back, killed him, cleared out the store. Lively story about that in the Liberty Tribune, the oldest weekly in western Missouri, still being published today. The wedding was held at Adler Joseph in St. Joseph, Missouri in January of 1870. With over 300 guests being dined at the expense of Mr. Feineman. Everyone had only the finest foods and beverages. The St. Joseph Gazette termed it decidedly the finest wedding that has ever been held in St. Joseph to this day. I'm sure it was. The ceremony was at Temple Adler Joseph, not the present one, an earlier building, and the dinner at a public hall in St. Joseph. At any rate, after the wedding, the happy couple, he 44, she 17, went on their honeymoon. And when they came home, they found in their house, her mother and her 3 sisters. And they remained there. Fortunately, for all around, the mother and all of her daughters became very active in Jewish life in Kansas City. The mother, and mother-in-law, was known far and wide as one who visited every Jewish home when there was an illness, whether a hovel or the richest family of the community, so it said in Kansas City Times. She neglected no one. She was beloved by all. Her daughters made up the choir at B'nai Jehudah for years. They and 2 gentlemen who were apparently not Jewish. Benjamin Feineman served as president of the congregation for years. He was president of District 2 B'nai B'rith for a time. He retired from business in the early 1890s, and the congregation made him the paid secretary at $50 a month. And we have the minute books written in a beautiful hand, most legible, by Mr. Feineman. When he died in 1912, the Kansas City Star said of him, he was, as his name, a fine man. He was beloved by all. We're talking about Benjamin Feineman, the patriarch of the congregation. By the way, Benjamin Feineman gave part of the lot that he acquired, the 12-grave lot, for the burial of Reverend Marcus Cohen's wife and then Marcus Cohen himself. Very generous man, a beloved man in the congregation. All of his children left Kansas City. In fact, of the descendants of founders of B'nai Jehudah, those who started the congregation in 1870, more than half had left Kansas City by the time of World War I. The Mooney family came here, I believe, from Alsace-Lorraine in the 1870s. My understanding is that the name originally was something like Monet, which would be French. They changed it to Mooney on coming here, but let there be any doubt, they were not of Irish descent, despite the name. Jacob Mooney is best known by me as one of the members who, in the minority, who wanted to retain in 1883 the man who was then the rabbi of B'nai Jehudah, Elias Epstein. But Elias Epstein was forced out by a membership vote, and instead they hired the freshly ordained Rabbi Joseph Krauskopf from the Hebrew Union College. That was engineered by Mr. Feineman, who was already then on the board of trustees of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He gained early prominence, not only locally, but nationally in Reform Judaism. This large monument, if you look at the inscription for Jacob Mooney's wife, there is some lettering in Hebrew, one of the very few Hebrew inscriptions in the B'nai Jehudah section of Elmwood. It's the last line of the Adon Olam, V'yado avkid ruchi be'edishan be'a'ira. In his hand I commit my spirit. and so forth. Unusual for a Reform Jewish couple, and I'm not sure whose idea it was. I suppose we could check with the great-grandson, J.D. Mooney, but I doubt that he would be able to clarify that. It says here that the Mooneys came from Bavaria, but my understanding is that they lived in Alsace-Lorraine for a time at least. The Hammerslauer monument is the tallest one in the B'nai Jehudah section of Elmwood Cemetery, which I suppose is appropriate for a man who was proud, wealthy until his later years, important and self-important. Louis Hammerslauer came from Hanover, Germany, with money. He followed three brothers of his to Baltimore, where they established one of the largest men's clothing manufacturing concerns in America. And then the brothers individually opened up retail stores. Louis Hammerslauer did so in Iowa at first, came here in 1856 and opened a branch store and called himself the King Clothier in daily ads in all of the newspapers. Sometimes quarter page, sometimes half page, occasionally full page. One of the full page ads is reprinted in the B'nai Jehudah history that I wrote, Roots in a Moving Stream. That was in 1865. He left Kansas City briefly during the Civil War because of the threat of Confederate troops overtaking the town. But he came back in time for the first train ever to reach Kansas City. Arrived in September of 1865, just a few months after Appomattox ended the Civil War. That train was pulled by a locomotive called the Louis Hammerslauer. It was the first train here to bring clothing from the East. The Hammerslauer brothers financed the tracks from St. Louis to Kansas City, according to a history of the city. So they had lots of money. In 1869, the brothers sold their business for several $1 million to a brother-in-law who used that money to take over Sears, Roebuck and Company. It was Hammerslauer money that financed Sears Roebuck in the beginning years.